After the divorce, her ex-husband and his ruthless lawyers made sure Catalina Ashford walked away with nothing. "No one wants a homeless woman," he'd said without flinching, then turned and left with his new mistress like discarding a broken thing. 11 months later, she was on her knees behind a cafe dumpster in Chicago's South Loop, digging through garbage in 15 below zero darkness with cracked, bleeding fingers. She'd been beaten in a shelter, robbed of her only sleeping bag during a blizzard, hospitalized for hypothermia, arrested for vagrancy, and now she was a 27-year-old skeleton, with a fresh scar across her forehead and ribs pressing through skin like a cage, with nothing left inside. That's when a black Rolls-Royce stopped at the mouth of the alley. The man who stepped out wasn't offering charity. He wore a 3-piece black suit, cashmere overcoat draped across his shoulders, and behind him stood another man with his hand resting inside his jacket in a way that had nothing to do with reaching for a wallet. He stopped a few feet from her, looked down at what remained of the woman who'd once been heir to a fashion empire, and spoke in a voice so low it could have passed for gentle, if not for the ice underneath. "Your mother's dead. She left you everything. The mansion in Greenwich Village, the fashion house. $500 million. And I owe her a debt I intend to repay." Catalina couldn't move. Tears spilled down hollow cheeks she no longer recognized, because her mother's words came flooding back like a wound torn open. "Don't marry that man, Cat. He doesn't love you. He loves what you have. The day you marry him is the day you lose everything." She hadn't listened. She'd been 22, and blind with love for Preston Whitmore, a man 15 years older who knew exactly how to make her feel like the center of the universe until he owned every piece of her. Margaret Ashford had begged her daughter not to go, then watched helplessly as Catalina disappeared into a marriage that would slowly erase her. And Margaret had died 10 days ago from pancreatic cancer, spending her final 2 years not fighting for her own life but quietly building a lifeline for the daughter who'd refused to answer her calls. Now Catalina stood in the frozen dark, barely breathing, staring at this dangerous stranger whose name she didn't know, and he said, "There's a condition. Your mother wanted you to remember what you're worth before you spend a single dollar of her money, and she wanted you to do it without depending on any man, including me." Those words hung in the frozen air like a breath that refused to dissolve. Catalina looked up from the garbage with her fingers still gripping a sandwich someone had barely touched, staring at a man whose coat whispered wealth and violence in equal measure, the kind of man her mother had once pulled from a world of darkness 30 years ago when she'd saved his mother's life, and she understood that everything was about to change, but the price would be facing every mistake, every silence, and every unspoken apology she owed a mother who'd watched her fall and waited until her very last breath for her daughter to come home. If this story already has your heart pounding, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this is just the beginning. Now let's go back to the moment Catalina climbed into that Rolls-Royce beside a man she didn't trust, carrying a dead woman's fortune and a set of impossible conditions that would either rebuild her or finish what her ex-husband started. As she sat there, Catalina could barely process the reality of how she had ended up inside the Rolls-Royce. Her legs were so numb from the cold that she couldn't feel them anymore, and when the car door shut, cutting off the shrieking wind of the Chicago winter night, the warmth inside hit her like a shock. The soft leather seats, the faint scent of sandalwood, the gentle golden light glowing from the ceiling, all of it belonged to a world she had forgotten a long time ago. The man sitting across from her didn't say another word after telling her about her mother's death. He opened a thick file and began reading as though she didn't exist, as though picking up a homeless woman from a pile of trash in the middle of a winter night was something he did every day. The second man, the one whose hand had stayed tucked inside his suit jacket the entire time in the alley, sat in the front passenger seat. He turned around, set a paper bag and a neatly folded set of clothes on the seat beside Catalina, and said in a low voice that was unexpectedly gentle, "There's hot food in the bag, clean clothes beside you, the bathroom is in the back. We're flying to New York. You've got about 2 hours." Catalina looked at the food bag, and her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't open it. She hadn't eaten anything hot in 3 weeks. The last thing she'd had that even resembled a meal was a cold cup of instant noodles she had found in a trash bin behind a laundromat. When she finally managed to open the paper bag and the smell of chicken soup spilled out, her body reacted before her will could interfere. She ate with both hands, fast and desperate, tears running down her face without her knowing why. And she felt horribly ashamed, but she couldn't stop. The man across from her never looked up from the file, never looked at her, never judged her. And somehow that deliberate indifference was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in the past 11 months. On the private jet, Catalina went into the bathroom to change. And for the first time in nearly a year, she stood before a mirror large enough to see her whole body. The woman staring back at her wasn't Catalina Ashford. She was a skeleton wrapped in skin, her cheekbones hollowed so deeply they cast shadows. The scar on her forehead still red and raised, her eyes sunken like two dark pits. But somewhere deep inside those eyes there was something that hadn't gone out completely, a small, stubborn spark refusing to die even though the body carrying it had almost given up. She put on the clean clothes, a gray cashmere sweater and black pants, exactly her size. Someone had known precisely what size she wore, and that made her shiver, because it meant she had been watched for a long time before tonight. When she returned to her seat, the man finally looked up. His gaze passed over her once, from head to toe. Not with the look of a man judging a woman, but with the look of someone checking whether something broken could still be repaired. And then he went back to the file. They landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey at 4 o'clock in the morning. Another black car drove them into Manhattan through the Lincoln Tunnel and stopped in front of an office tower in Midtown, the 37th floor, the office of Philippa Crane. The woman waiting for them behind an oak desk stood up the moment Catalina walked in. She was nearly 60. With silver hair cut short and neat, her eyes sharp. But when she looked at Catalina, they softened in the way only someone who had known her since childhood could soften. She didn't hug Catalina. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply said, "Sit down, child. There are many things you need to know, and we don't have much time." Philippa Crane explained everything in the voice of a lawyer, precise and stripped of unnecessary emotion. Margaret Ashford had died 10 days earlier of pancreatic cancer. She had fought the illness for 2 years, but refused aggressive treatment because she had spent all her time and strength preparing an inheritance for her daughter. She left everything to Catalina: the historic mansion in Greenwich Village, the Ashford Haute Couture brand, her private art collection, and an estate estimated at $500 million. But there were 3 non-negotiable conditions. First, Catalina had to restore Ashford Haute Couture to its peak status within 1 year. Second, she had to stop the real estate development project of the Whitmore family, which was threatening to destroy the entire historic neighborhood of Greenwich Village, including the Ashford mansion. Third, and Philippa paused for a beat before saying this condition, Catalina was not to receive any financial support from any man. Everything she rebuilt had to come from her own hands and her own mind. Margaret had written clearly in the will, "You lost yourself by depending on a man. You will find yourself again by standing alone." Catalina heard every word as if a blade were cutting into her. Her mother had known, had seen, had understood everything, and still loved her enough to plan her rescue even after Catalina had refused every phone call, every letter, every hand her mother had reached out to her. Then Catalina turned toward the man who had been standing by the window throughout the conversation, his back to them, staring out at Manhattan in the darkness before dawn. "So who is he?" she asked Philippa. "And why is he here?" Philippa looked at the man, then back at Catalina. "This is Tristan Valenti. He heads the Valenti family." The name hung in the air, and Catalina felt the blood inside her turn cold because she knew that name. Everyone in New York knew that name. It appeared in the news and in whispered conversations, and in the stories people told when they wanted to remind each other that there were powers running this city that no one dared touch. Philippa went on. 30 years ago, his mother, Francesca Valenti, was beaten almost to death by her husband. Margaret happened to meet her in the hospital and helped her escape, hid her for 2 years, helped her build a new life. The Valenti family had carried that debt to your mother for 3 decades, and before she died, Margaret called Francesca for the first time in 30 years and said only one sentence, "My daughter needs to be protected from a monster. And this time I can't do it myself anymore." Tristan turned around. His eyes met Catalina's for the first time in enough light for her to see clearly. And in those eyes she saw no warmth, no pity, only a cold and absolute determination. He said, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Margaret. She saved my mother's life, and I'm repaying that debt. When the debt is paid, I'll disappear from your life as if I'd never existed." Catalina looked straight into his eyes, and for the first time in 11 months, she felt something other than fear and despair. She felt anger that a strange man was standing here speaking of her mother with a respect she herself hadn't given her in 5 years. Anger that her mother had needed to ask a mafia boss to protect her daughter, instead of being protected by her own daughter. And deepest of all, anger because somewhere far down inside, she knew she needed that protection, even though she hated having to admit it. The black car stopped in front of the brownstone mansion on a quiet street in Greenwich Village, just as dawn was beginning to break. Catalina sat in the car looking out, and everything came rushing back at once. The dark oak door with the brass knocker she had once had to stand on tiptoe to reach as a child, the stone steps where her mother used to sit with her coffee on autumn mornings, the third-floor window where she had once sat drawing the first sketch of her life beneath the warm yellow glow of a table lamp. 5 years. She hadn't stepped through that door in 5 years, and now her mother was no longer inside it. Tristan didn't get out of the car. He only said through the lowered window, "Nico will stay outside. If you need anything, call." And then the Rolls-Royce glided away in silence. Catalina stood alone before the door with the key Felipa had given her, an old brass key engraved with a pattern she recognized immediately, because it was identical to the one she used to wear around her neck as a girl. Her mother had kept it for her through all the years she had been gone. The moment the door opened, Dottie Rollins was already standing there, as if she had been waiting in the foyer all night. And perhaps she truly had. She embraced Catalina with the trembling arms of a woman nearing 70, but she held her with the strength of someone who had been waiting for this moment for 5 years. She couldn't speak in full words, only broken sobs, and the same 2 words, repeated again and again. "My girl, my girl, my girl." Edmund Hale stood behind Dottie, his back straight as always, his hands clasped behind him, in the habit of a man who had managed an estate professionally for 40 years, but tears were running down his worn face, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He only said one sentence. "Miss Catalina, your mother never stopped preparing for this day. Everything is ready." Then a young woman stepped out from the back hallway, her black hair tied neatly, dressed in black as though in mourning, but her eyes carried not grief, but something sharper. Margot Chambers, her cousin, the little girl who had once followed her all through the mansion asking about fabrics and seams, was now a grown woman, and the eyes that had once been full of stars were now hard as stone. Margot didn't hug her, didn't greet her, only said in a flat voice, "You should see for yourself how bad Ashford Haute Couture has become before you promise anything about saving it. We'll meet tomorrow morning," then turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Dottie whispered, "Don't mind her. She's carried too much alone for too long. She'll understand." But Catalina didn't blame Margot, because she knew she deserved that look and more than that. Dottie led her up to the 3rd floor. Catalina's old bedroom was unchanged in every detail. The book she had been reading still lay on the bedside table. The page she had folded at the corner still held its crease. The chair by the window still had the cushion where she used to sit for hours sketching. Her mother had preserved this room like a museum built for hope, as though if everything stayed untouched, her daughter would come home. On the bed was a new set of clothes, in exactly her size, and a thick envelope in handwriting so familiar that Catalina had to grip the bedpost to keep from falling. She opened the letter with fingers still cracked and bleeding even though they had been bandaged on the plane. "My dearest daughter, if you're reading these words, then I'm gone. But you've come home, and that is all I prayed for. I have to tell you the truth because you deserve to know it, even though it will hurt. I hired detectives to follow you from the first day you were out on the street. I knew where you slept every night. I knew about the night you were beaten at the shelter in West Garfield Park. I knew about the night your sleeping bag was stolen in the January snowstorm. I knew about the night you lay in the emergency room at Stroger Hospital with hypothermia. I knew everything, and every time I held myself back from running to you, I felt part of myself die. But I knew that if I came to you, you would go back to him because you weren't ready to see the truth. He had to destroy the illusion completely before you could wake up. I was right, and I hate that more than anything in this world." Catalina finished reading and the world tilted. She slid to the floor, her back against the bed, clutching the letter to her chest, and cried not with the hopeless sobs of a homeless woman digging through trash on a winter night, but with the grief of a daughter who had finally understood that she had been loved in the cruelest and greatest way possible. That night she couldn't sleep. She wandered through every room of the mansion in the dark, touching the walls her mother had touched, sitting in the chairs her mother had sat in, and in Margaret's study she found it. A wall covered in photographs, hundreds of them, recording her whole life from birth to her 22nd birthday, the final one taken before the wedding. But beside that was a newer section, photographs taken from a distance, blurred, trembling, of her sitting outside a shelter staring into nothing, of her curled beneath an overpass during a snowstorm almost disappearing into a pile of rags, of her walking down the street with her body bent forward as if she were carrying the entire world on her back. Beneath the photograph of the overpass, in her mother's trembling handwriting, were the words, "This was the night I almost broke my promise. This was the night I almost ran to you." Beside the wall of photographs was a small velvet-wrapped box. Inside were the things Catalina had lost on the streets, the cheap bracelet she bought in a thrift store when she had first been thrown out, the scrap of cloth she tore from her old coat to wrap around her hands in the cold, even the public library card she used to get into the library to warm herself on winter days. Her mother had hired someone to recover every small object, worthless to anyone else, but proof that she had followed every step of her daughter's fall. Catalina was still clutching the box when the phone vibrated. Philippa had given her a new phone before she left the office, and somehow Preston Whitmore already had her number. His message was brief and cold as a blade. "Heard you hit the jackpot. Congratulations. My lawyer will be in touch soon. Remember that our 5 years of marriage still carry legal weight, and I expect proper compensation. Don't force me to do this the hard way." Right below it was a formal email from the law office, a lawsuit demanding 50% of the inheritance on the grounds that Preston had supported Catalina throughout the marriage and was entitled to compensation. Catalina stared at the screen until the words blurred, and she thought that he couldn't even give her one single night to mourn her mother without facing his poison. Then the phone vibrated again. Unknown number. The message contained only one line. "I've had someone watching him since the moment you left Chicago. He's in the penthouse on Central Park West with his mistress. He's drinking and calling his lawyer. Don't panic." And Catalina didn't need anyone to tell her who had sent it, because there was only one person in this world who wrote messages like commands and somehow still made her feel a little less alone in a house full of her mother's ghosts. The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York on Pearl Street looked from the outside like a gray fortress, and when Catalina stepped onto the stone stairs that morning, she felt as if she were walking into the mouth of a beast. Philippa walked beside her. Henderson Wolfe walked ahead, a 70-year-old man with hair as white as snow, but with a stride heavy and solid like a man about to kick down some door. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters and photographers, flashbulbs exploding without pause, someone shouting her name, someone asking how it felt to inherit money from the mother she had abandoned, and Catalina swallowed every word the way a person swallows glass. But she didn't stop walking. Then she saw him. Preston Whitmore stood on the highest step in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, wearing a familiar smile that made her sick to her stomach, and beside him was Nadine Turner, 23 years old, visibly pregnant beneath a white dress, his arm wrapped around her waist with the same possessive gesture Catalina recognized instantly because he had once wrapped his arm around her that exact way, not in tenderness, but in ownership, like marking territory. He wanted her to see it. He wanted her to know that she had been replaced, that she had no value, that he had moved on while she had been digging through trash. But when their eyes met through the crowd, Catalina felt nothing. No pain, no jealousy, no anger. Only a cold emptiness where the wound had once been. And she realized that 11 months on the streets had burned the part of her that once loved him down to ash. Inside the courtroom, Beckett Shaw rose and began his argument with the confidence of a man who had never lost. He was nearly 40, sharp-featured, with a voice polished for persuasion, and every word he spoke was designed to turn Preston into a victim. "Your Honor, my client spent 5 years supporting his wife during a period when she completely severed ties with her family. He provided housing, finances, stability. He stood by her when her own mother refused to help. Now the defendant is benefiting from an inheritance worth hundreds of millions of dollars, wealth she did nothing to earn, while my client, the man who truly supported her in her hardship, receives nothing. We are not asking for charity. We are asking for recognition that marriage is a partnership and that the sacrifices made within that partnership deserve respect." He turned Catalina into an ungrateful woman and Preston into a saint in only a few minutes, and the most frightening part was that he did it so smoothly that even Catalina briefly doubted herself. Philippa Crane stood with a calm so chilling it silenced the room. "Your Honor, Mr. Shaw has just presented a very beautiful fairy tale. Allow me to provide the truth." Catalina Ashford didn't sever ties with her mother out of indifference. She was systematically isolated by a controlling husband, who recognized that her mother was the only voice capable of helping her see reality. Margaret Ashford didn't refuse to help her daughter. She refused to enable an abusive relationship by providing resources that Mr. Whitmore would control. That was an act of desperate love, not abandonment. Philippa stepped toward the judge, drawing attention without demanding it. As for Mr. Whitmore's so-called support, we will prove that he systematically controlled every resource available to the defendant, isolated her from professional opportunity, and used financial dependence as a tool of psychological abuse. Support and control are not synonyms. Judge Rosalind Kay listened with an unreadable face, sharp eyes behind silver-framed glasses. She allowed testimony from both sides and set the schedule, her voice impartial. But when she looked at Catalina, there was something in her eyes that suggested she had seen too many women sitting in that chair. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again, but Catalina didn't hear a single question, because her eyes were fixed on two men in dark clothes, walking parallel to her on the opposite sidewalk. They didn't look like reporters. They didn't look like pedestrians. They moved in sync with her. When she stopped, they stopped. When she walked, they walked. And the survival instinct, sharpened by nearly a year on the streets, began screaming in her head at once. Then, Nico Ferraro appeared out of the crowd as if from nowhere. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. He simply stepped out from the flow of people on Pearl Street and walked straight toward the two men, with the easy stride of someone taking a stroll through a park. But there was something in the way he moved that made both men stop, then turn and disappear into the crowd so quickly that Catalina wondered whether she had imagined them. Her phone vibrated. Tristan's voice came through without greeting, without long explanation. Preston hired men to watch you. 2 of them. Amateurs. Handled. From now on, you have protection 24 hours a day. Nico or one of my people will always be close. Catalina stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, pedestrians flowing around her like water around stone, and she felt anger rising from somewhere very deep. I didn't agree to that, she said. I just escaped one man who controlled everything I did. I don't need another man deciding for me. Whether you think you're protecting me or not, this is still control, and I'm done being controlled. Silence stretched across the line. Then Tristan said in a voice that didn't change at all, I understand how you feel, and I don't care. Preston Whitmore just hired people to follow you outside a federal courthouse, and if he's willing to do that in public, then what he'll do when no one is looking will be far worse. This isn't a request, Catalina. This isn't an offer. This is how it will work until the threat is over. She wanted to shout into the phone, wanted to tell him he had no right, that her mother had left a condition saying she had to stand on her own, that she didn't need anyone to save her. But deep inside, in the place where pride and truth collided, she knew he was right. Preston wasn't the kind of man who gave up, and 11 months on the streets of Chicago had taught her one simple and brutal lesson. Pride doesn't keep you warm at night, and principles don't stop a fist. She hung up without saying another word because if she opened her mouth, she would have to admit that for the first time in a very long while, knowing someone was standing guard in the shadows made it a little easier to breathe, and she wasn't ready to admit that to anyone, especially not to a mafia boss she had known for less than 48 hours. The deposition room had no windows, and the white fluorescent lights washed everything in a sickly pale shade. And Catalina thought whoever had designed this room had done it on purpose, had created a place meant to drain hope out of anyone sitting in the chair across from the lawyers. Dottie Rollins sat there with her hands folded on the table, carrying the dignity of a woman who had served a distinguished family her entire life. But Catalina could see her fingers trembling. Beckett Shaw began in a voice of false politeness that turned courtesy into a weapon. Mrs. Rollins, how long have you worked for the Ashford family? Since Catalina was a newborn baby. I've been with them from then until now. So you witnessed Catalina's entire life, her childhood, her adulthood, her decision to marry my client. I witnessed a little girl grow up in love, and then be lured away from everything she knew by a man. Beckett Shaw didn't flinch. During the marriage, did Catalina have any contact with her mother? Dottie was silent for a beat, and Catalina saw pain move across her face like a passing shadow. Yes, she called constantly in the early years, weekly and then daily, growing more desperate each time. I heard Margaret cry after every call she refused to take. Beckett leaned forward. So Margaret Ashford deliberately refused to speak with her own daughter. Margaret refused to help destroy her daughter by providing resources that man would control. She saw clearly that anything she gave Catalina would flow straight into Mr. Whitmore's hands, and she would rather lose her daughter than watch her sink deeper into that trap. That wasn't refusal. That was the most painful act of love I have ever witnessed in my life. Beckett made a note, his pen scratching across the paper with crisp certainty. Tell the court how Margaret reacted when she learned Catalina had been divorced and left homeless. Dottie's whole body began to shake. She tried to hold herself together, but her voice shattered like glass. She was in the hospital. The illness was already very advanced, and when she heard the news, she pulled out her own IV, put on her own clothes, called for a car herself, and went home, even though the doctors said she could die at any moment. She went home and began making plans immediately, day and night, without stopping. She wrote the will. She called lawyers. She contacted everyone she had ever known. She worked until her body couldn't do any more, then lay down and kept working from the bed. She died while she was still planning how to save her daughter. Dottie's tears fell onto the wooden table, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall like evidence. Catalina felt the room tilt. But this time she didn't run outside. She gripped the arms of the chair and forced herself to stay still, because she had promised herself after the first court hearing that she wouldn't give Preston one more image of her weakness for him to turn into a weapon. The next witness was Edmund Hale. He sat down with the posture of a man who had managed tens of millions of dollars in assets for 4 decades. His back straight, his voice even, every answer precise as a balance sheet. Beckett asked about the financial state of the estate during Catalina's absence, and Edmund described it methodically. Margaret mortgaged the mansion, sold personal belongings of great sentimental value, even transferred money from her own medical care fund to cover the salaries of company employees. She was dying, and she used the money meant for her treatment to keep her daughter's business from collapsing. Then Beckett asked whether Edmund knew anything about the relationship between Preston and Margaret, and this was the moment the air in the deposition room changed. Edmund said in a voice without emotion, but each word landed heavy as lead. Immediately after the wedding, Mr. Whitmore attempted to gain access to the trust fund established when Catalina was born. He contacted the bank, claiming he needed to manage his wife's finances in order to protect her. Margaret discovered it and froze the trust immediately. Mr. Whitmore came to the mansion and threatened Margaret. He said she would regret interfering in his marriage. He became aggressive with the staff, and I was about to call the police, but I didn't need to because someone arrived and forced Mr. Whitmore to leave. Beckett Shaw lifted his eyes from his notes. Who? I don't know the name. I only know that after that person spoke to Mr. Whitmore outside the door, Mr. Whitmore left very quickly and never came back to the mansion again. Whatever that person said, it worked better than any call to the police. Catalina saw Beckett Shaw stop writing. For a few seconds, he wrote nothing, his eyes resting on the page without seeing the words, and she realized that this detail was something Preston had never told his lawyer, that he had gone to his mother-in-law's house to threaten an older woman and had been sent away like a dog. That story didn't fit the image of the devoted, supportive husband Beckett had built. The last session of the day was Margot, and she entered the room as if she were entering a battle, her back straight, her eyes bright, the anger she had held down for years finally having a place to pour itself out. Beckett asked about the condition of Ashford Haute Couture, and Margot answered with ruthless precision. About a year after Catalina got married, vendors suddenly refused to work with us. Clients mysteriously stopped responding. Standard loan applications were denied without explanation. I investigated and discovered that representatives from Whitmore Development had contacted every supplier and offered better terms if they stopped working with us. I have emails from clients admitting they were pressured to leave us. I have records showing a pattern of deliberate sabotage that matches exactly the timing of Catalina's wedding. Margot looked straight at Beckett Shaw. Mr. Whitmore didn't just control his wife. He wanted her to have nothing left to return to if she ever woke up. He destroyed the family business. He isolated her from her mother. He created a pit she couldn't escape. And when he got tired of her, he shoved her into that pit and walked away. Beckett Shaw didn't object, didn't interrupt, didn't ask Margot to answer only the question. He just sat there and wrote, and Catalina saw that his hand was moving more slowly, as if the weight of the truth were making the pen heavier. When the session ended and everyone stood, Catalina didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't need to grip the chair for support. Instead, she felt something new burning inside her chest. Not the familiar pain, but anger. Clean and hot and vivid anger. The anger of a woman who had finally seen the full picture of what had been done to her and to her mother, And for the first time since she climbed into the Rolls-Royce in that dark Chicago alley, Catalina didn't feel as though she was trying to survive. She felt as though she wanted to fight. Beckett Shaw walked away from the case 2 days after the depositions, without offering any public explanation, and Preston replaced him with Aldrich Voss, a 50-year-old man with a face carved from granite and a reputation for turning victims into defendants in every courtroom he entered. Voss didn't waste time. His first move was to file an emergency motion to freeze the entire inheritance on the grounds that Catalina Ashford was not mentally competent to manage such a vast estate after months of living on the streets. He placed before Judge K a stack of records so thick that Catalina felt her stomach tighten just looking at it. Photographs of her sitting outside shelters staring into nothing, photographs of her digging through trash, photographs of her lying on a park bench in the dead of winter, arrest records for vagrancy in Cook County, hospital records from Stroger for severe hypothermia. Voss spoke in a voice dripping with false concern. "Your Honor, we are not attacking Miss Ashford. We are concerned for her. A woman who has endured trauma of this magnitude cannot suddenly shoulder financial responsibility for hundreds of millions of dollars without proper evaluation. We ask the court to protect her from herself." The way he said it made Preston sound like a saint worried about his former wife, and made Catalina sound like a madwoman about to set fire to a mountain of money. And the thing that made Catalina want to scream most was that it almost sounded convincing. Judge K did not freeze the assets, but she appointed Dr. Geneva Locke, a court-selected psychiatrist, to conduct a full evaluation. Dr. Locke's office was on the 12th floor of a building on the Upper West Side, with windows overlooking Central Park, and the woman sitting across from Catalina had warm eyes but no softness of the gullible kind, the kind of person who had heard 1,000 stories and judged none of them, but had never once been fooled by any of them either. She said, "I've read all the court records. I know what other people say about you. Now I want to hear it in your own voice." Across multiple sessions that stretched for hours, Catalina told her everything. She spoke about Preston, not with anger, but with the cold precision of someone who had stared at her marriage long enough to see every thread of manipulation. The way he began with gentle suggestions, "You don't have to talk to your mother today if you don't want to," and turned it into total isolation. The way he took control of money by offering to manage it for her because she was too busy designing, then slowly cut off every point of access. The way he eroded her identity day by day, mild criticism turning into mockery, turning into complete denial of who she was until she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself anymore. She spoke about the divorce, the way he and his lawyer stripped her down to the last cent and pushed her onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her body. She spoke about the 11 months of homelessness, and when Dr. Locke asked about the darkest moment, Catalina stopped for the first time in all the evaluation sessions. "There was one night," she said, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Around the 7th month, I stood on the Michigan Avenue Bridge looking down at the Chicago River at 3 in the morning, the water black and freezing. And I thought that if I jumped, everything would stop. The hunger would stop, the cold would stop, the shame would stop. And I stood there for a long time, long enough for my feet to go numb, but then I heard my mother's voice in my head, not warning me about Preston, but saying what she used to say when I was little every time I fell. 'Get up, Cat. You're stronger than you think.' And I stepped down from the railing." Dr. Locke gave no visible reaction, but she wrote for a long time after that answer. She kept asking about Catalina's life now, about the work of restoring Ashford Haute Couture, about her relationship with Margot and Dottie and Edmund, about her plan to protect the neighborhood, and Catalina described it all with a clarity and sense of purpose that surprised even her as she heard herself speak. When the final session ended, Dr. Locke looked at her with an expression Catalina couldn't read and said, "The report will be filed with the court next week. I want to speak with you privately before it becomes part of the public record." 1 week later, in that private meeting, Dr. Locke spoke plainly. "What I found was not instability or incompetence. I found severe complex psychological trauma from years of prolonged emotional abuse. But I also found a woman recovering at an extraordinary pace, using healthy coping mechanisms, building genuine supportive relationships, and demonstrating entirely normal decision-making capacity. My report strongly recommends that the court investigate Mr. Whitmore's conduct throughout the marriage, because the patterns you described are classic signs of coercive control." When the report was released, the court lifted every restriction on the assets, and Voss responded by calling the evaluation biased. But Dr. Locke's credibility was too solid, and the accusation fell like a stone thrown at a fortress wall. That night, Catalina couldn't sleep. She went downstairs to the kitchen at 2 a.m, and when she turned on the light, she nearly cried out because Tristan Valenti was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, sleeves of his black shirt rolled up, a glass of water in front of him, his eyes open and fully alert, as though darkness were his natural habitat. He didn't startle. He didn't explain himself. She asked, her voice still shaky from the shock. "Do you ever sleep?" He answered without looking at her. "Not when someone is trying to harm what I've been entrusted to protect." Catalina pulled out a chair, sat down across from him, and said in a voice calmer than she thought she could manage, "I'm not a thing." Tristan finally looked up, and for the first time since the night in that Chicago alley, his eyes were not cold, not completely warm, but the ice had thinned enough for her to see there was something underneath, something he was trying very hard not to let show. He said very quietly, "Right, you're not. That's the problem." Then silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, not the tense kind, but the kind of silence that happens when two people realize something has shifted between them that neither of them planned, and neither of them knows what to do with. Catalina didn't ask him what problem he meant. He didn't explain. She got up, poured herself a glass of water, then went back to her room, and when she lay down in bed in the dark, she realized that for the first time in a very long while, she felt safe enough to close her eyes, and that frightened her more than any threat Preston had made, because it meant she was beginning to trust a man she knew very well was far more dangerous than her ex-husband had ever been. Cordelia Fitzpatrick arrived at the mansion on a Saturday morning without warning, stepping through the door with the bearing of someone familiar with every brick in this house. She was 67 years old, her silver hair cut to perfection, her back straight as a sword, wearing a cream wool coat that Catalina recognized at once as one of her mother's designs from the final collection. Dottie led her into the sitting room, and when Cordelia saw Catalina, she stood still for a moment, her eyes moving across her face with a look that was appraising but not cruel, then softening into something like recognition. "You look exactly like your mother," Cordelia said softly. "Like Margaret when we were young, and believed that beautiful design and iron will could change the world." Cordelia explained that she and Margaret had been best friends for 40 years, ever since they were both young women trying to make names for themselves in New York. Margaret in fashion, and Cordelia in the world of Upper East Side philanthropy. When the Whitmore family began buying up property around Greenwich Village, with plans to destroy the entire historic neighborhood and replace it with luxury towers, Margaret had been the first to stand against them, and Cordelia had fought beside her through those final years. "We went to every hearing, wrote every letter, knocked on every city council door," Cordelia said. "Your mother never gave up, no matter how sick she became. There were mornings when she came to meetings after a night of chemotherapy, with hair falling beneath her scarf. But her voice was still sharp as a blade. She said this neighborhood was where she raised her daughter, and she would rather die than watch it be leveled." Then Cordelia set a file on the table, as thick as 4 fingers, bound in brown leather, with no label. "This is everything we collected over the years on the Whitmore family," she said, lowering her voice even though the two of them were alone in the room. "Evidence of bribing city officials to speed up project approvals, manipulating property prices by threatening residents and shop owners into selling cheap, falsified environmental assessment reports, connections between Garrett Whitmore during his years as a federal judge and the developers whose cases he oversaw. Margaret and I gathered every piece over nearly 10 years. Some of it can be used in court. Some of it is simply truth that wealthy families don't want exposed. How you use it is your decision." Catalina touched the file but didn't open it yet. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Cordelia looked at her directly. "Because your mother called me a week before she died and asked me to watch over you if I could. She said you would need allies, and she wanted to make sure you had the right people beside you. I don't know whether I'm the right person or not, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." After Cordelia left, Catalina carried the file into her mother's study and spent the whole afternoon reading every page. Every page was evidence of systematic greed, of the way the Whitmore family viewed an entire neighborhood full of history and human lives as obstacles to be cleared away so they could build more soulless glass towers. And every page was also evidence of her mother's fighting spirit. A woman dying by degrees who still sat sorting documents and writing notes in margins with handwriting that grew shakier and shakier. That evening, Catalina knocked on Margot's door for the first time since coming home. Margot opened it with caution in her face. But when Catalina said, "I need your help to save Ashford Haute Couture," and I don't know where to begin without you." Something in Margot's eyes changed. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Yet recognition that she was truly trying. They began working together that very night. Margot taught Catalina everything about the state of the company. Which clients were still loyal. Which suppliers might be willing to come back. Which debts were crushing them. And Catalina began to design. She sketched a tribute collection for her mother. A story told in fabric and seams instead of words. Beginning in innocence with soft materials and pale colors of childhood. Then gradually shifting into darkness, with bodices pulled tight and sleeves like restraints and collars transformed into chains, before exploding into the final looks with sharp architectural cuts and bold colors that didn't ask anyone's permission to exist. Every garment was a chapter in her own story, but also the story of every woman who had ever been trapped inside false beauty and found a way out. They worked deep into the night, the floor of the design room covered in sketches and fabric swatches, and one evening, when Catalina handed Margot the drawing of the wedding gown that would close the collection, a white architectural dress unlike any traditional bridal gown, more like a declaration of independence sewn into fabric. Margot looked at it for a very long time and then said quietly, "Your mother would love these. They have her spirit but your voice. This is what she always wanted for you. Not for you to follow in her footsteps, but to find your own." Catalina didn't cry because she had cried enough already, but she felt something warm begin to fill her chest, in the place where the abyss had once lived, and she thought perhaps this was what her mother had meant when she wrote, "Remember your worth," not money or property or the mansion, but that moment when her hand held a pencil and the lines poured out like blood through her veins, natural and unstoppable, and she knew she had been born to do this. The package arrived at the mansion on the afternoon before the night of the show, with no sender's name, only a white cardboard box tied with a black ribbon like a gift for a funeral. Edmund carried it into the sitting room, and when Catalina opened it, she saw her mother's wedding veil, the Chantilly lace veil Margaret had worn on her wedding day 50 years earlier, the veil Catalina had touched as a little girl when she asked her mother whether one day she would get to wear it. But now it was no longer whole. It had been ripped apart with deliberate violence, not torn by accident, but wrenched into pieces and stuffed back into the box, like the corpse of something that had been killed. Beneath it was a note in Preston's handwriting. "If you destroy everything I built, I'll destroy everything your mother left behind. This is only the beginning." Catalina stood looking at the veil lying in the box like a disemboweled creature, and she didn't cry because she understood now that tears were what Preston wanted, the fuel he ran on, and she refused to give him another drop. Tristan arrived at the mansion 30 minutes after Nico alerted him. He looked at the veil for a long time, and Catalina saw something change in his eyes. Not hot anger, but a cold, dense darkness pouring down into them like ink spilled into water, and Nico had to place a hand on his shoulder, not to hold him back, but to remind him, and Tristan stood very still beneath that hand for a long moment before saying in a voice so soft it was almost impossible to hear, "He will pay for this. Not today, but he will pay." Catalina looked at him and said, "Not now. Right now we have a show." The show was at the Marlton Hotel, a historic building in the heart of Greenwich Village, set directly inside the zone Preston's development project wanted to flatten, and Catalina had chosen the location deliberately. Every old wall in it was a reminder that some things were worth protecting. Tristan didn't ask her opinion about security. He simply placed men throughout the building, 2 guarding the front entrance, 2 at the back, Nico personally watching the basement where the electrical system and backup generator were located, and when Catalina asked whether this level of protection was really necessary, Tristan answered, "Preston just sent you a shredded wedding veil with a threat attached. So what do you think?" The guests filled the hall. Every important fashion editor, every critic, every influential person in the industry, and the entire Whitmore family as well. Preston sitting in the 3rd row with Nadine beside him, his face wearing the smug smile of a man convinced that tonight would end in disaster. The lights dimmed. The music began. The show opened, and from the first moment the hall fell silent. The first look stepped out beneath warm golden light, chiffon and white silk drifting softly. The gentle colors of childhood, of summer afternoons in a garden with a mother, of dreams not yet stained, and the audience murmured in admiration. Then the collection shifted. The fabric grew heavier, darker, the bodices began to tighten, the sleeves narrowed until they looked almost like restraints. The collars rose higher until they became something more like chains than clothing. Everything still beautiful, but beautiful in a suffocating way. the beauty of a gilded cage that looked magnificent from the outside, but from within was a prison. Understanding moved through the room like fire spreading across water. Catalina was telling her story, and everyone could hear it without a single spoken word. The final section exploded. Deep red and black, and pure white. Architectural cuts, sharp as knives. Fabric moving like armor, each look a declaration from a woman who refused to ask anyone's permission to exist. And the final piece, the white architectural gown Margot had studied for so long that night in the design room, stepped onto the runway like a silent detonation. The audience rose to its feet before the final model had even left the runway. The applause thundered so hard Catalina felt it in her bones. Editors cried openly. Reporters hammered wildly on their phones. Orders began pouring in less than 5 minutes after the show ended, and Catalina stood behind the curtain looking out into the hall for Preston. And there he was, frozen in his seat, the smug smile utterly gone, replaced by the face of a man who had just realized that she had told his story in front of the entire fashion world, without speaking his name once. And everyone understood, everyone knew, and he couldn't sue her for defamation because she hadn't spoken a single word. Her eyes found Tristan. He was standing at the far end of the hall with his back against the wall, not applauding, not taking notes, only watching her over the heads of hundreds of people. And when their eyes met, he nodded once, so slightly that no one else would have noticed. Then Nico appeared by the wings, his suit jacket slightly disordered and the knuckles of one hand scraped raw, something Catalina had never seen on the man who was always perfect down to every fold in his clothes. He said quietly, "We caught a man in the basement cutting electrical lines near the main distribution cabinet. If he'd finished, the overload would have caused a fire while 400 people were packed inside a hall without exits wide enough to clear them in time." He admitted Preston Whitmore hired him. Catalina felt the floor tilt beneath her when she realized Preston hadn't only wanted to ruin her show, he had been willing to burn a building full of people to do it. Tristan stepped to her side, his voice not changing in the slightest, as if stopping an arson attempt in the middle of an event with 400 people was the kind of thing he handled before breakfast. "It's handled. You're safe. Everyone is safe." Catalina looked at him. "What does handled mean?" Tristan looked back at her with eyes that gave away nothing. "It means you don't need to know." 3 nights after the fashion show, Catalina was sitting in the design room, processing orders that were coming in faster than she and Margot could keep up with, when Edmund knocked on the door with an uneasy expression and said there was a man at the door claiming to be Beckett Shaw and insisting that he needed to see her immediately. Catalina hadn't even had time to react when Tristan's voice cut in from the hallway behind her. "I knew he'd come. Let him in." She turned and saw Tristan leaning against the frame of the design room doorway, his arms folded across his chest, and she wanted to ask since when he'd been there, but she had stopped asking that question because the answer was always the same. He was always there. Beckett Shaw stepped into the sitting room looking nothing like the sharp lawyer Catalina remembered from the courtroom. His tie loosened, dark circles beneath his eyes, the file case in his hand gripped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He saw Tristan and paused for a beat, clearly not expecting this man's presence. But then he swallowed whatever he had been about to say and turned to Catalina. "I left Preston Whitmore's case 2 weeks ago because I couldn't keep representing a man I knew was lying. I'm here because I have documents about his development project that you need to see." Tristan stepped forward and stood in the middle of the room. He didn't block Beckett, but his presence filled the space in a way that made everyone else seem smaller. He spoke in the low voice Catalina had learned to recognize as his most dangerous one, because it sounded the calmest. "The question is whether you're here because you have the courage to go all the way, or because you want to ease your conscience and disappear. Because if it's the second reason, then you're wasting all of our time." Beckett looked at Tristan, and Catalina saw that he wasn't afraid, or at least that he hid his fear well enough. And then he said something she hadn't expected. "My mother lived with my father for 17 years. My father was the best lawyer in Connecticut, respected by everyone, and at home he beat his wife every time he drank. My mother never left because she believed no one would believe her, that it was her fault, that he would change. She died still believing those things, and I grew up swearing I'd never become my father. But when I sat in that deposition room listening to Catalina's family describe the exact pattern my father used on my mother, I realized I didn't need to lay a hand on anyone to become my father. I only had to stand beside men like him and defend them." The room went silent. Tristan looked at Beckett for a long time, then stepped aside and made space, and Catalina understood that was his way of saying he believed him. Beckett placed the file on the table. Inside were documents about Preston's development project, bribes to officials in the planning department, falsified structural reports claiming historic buildings were structurally unsafe in order to justify demolition, secret contracts with contractors tied to the Whitmore family. Tristan reviewed each page, then pushed the file toward Catalina and said, "It's enough to bury him, but you decide when and how. This is your war, not mine." Catalina looked at him and realized this was the second time he had handed control to her, instead of giving orders, and each time he did it, she felt the distance between suspicion and trust narrow a little more. They hadn't even had time to discuss it further when Catalina's phone vibrated. Unknown number. The woman's voice on the other end was shaking so badly it was almost impossible to understand. "I'm Nadine. I need help. I'm at Mount Sinai Hospital. I'm in labor. But that's not why I'm calling. He pushed me, Catalina. We were fighting about your show, about you, and he pushed me down the stairs. The baby is coming early because he pushed me, and I'm afraid he'll come back." Catalina's first instinct was to hang up because this was the woman who had replaced her, the woman standing beside Preston at the courthouse. But there was something in Nadine's voice, pure panic, desperation that couldn't be faked, that sounded so painfully familiar Catalina recognized it as her own voice from 2 years earlier. "I'm coming right now." Tristan didn't ask questions. He stood, reached for his coat, and said, "I'm coming with you." On the drive to Mount Sinai, Catalina explained briefly. Tristan didn't comment, only called Nico and gave orders in rapid Italian before hanging up. At the hospital, Tristan stopped in the hallway and said, "You go in. If he shows up, that's my problem." Nadine was lying in a hospital bed connected to monitors, her face swollen from crying and pain, her pregnant stomach large beneath the hospital gown, and the moment she saw Catalina, tears rushed down her face. "You really came. I didn't think you would." Catalina sat beside the bed, took Nadine's hand, and listened as she told a story Catalina had already lived through: the slow isolation, the financial control, criticism turning into humiliation, and tonight when Nadine said your show was beautiful, Preston lost control and shoved her halfway down the staircase. Catalina tightened her grip on Nadine's hand and said, "You need to make a police report right now. Document everything. Don't let him convince you it was an accident." Nadine nodded, trembling but determined, and when NYPD officers arrived to take her statement, she showed them the bruises on her arm that matched her account, the scrape marks on her back from the stairs, the medical record confirming the baby had come early because of trauma. 2 hours later, the baby was born. A little girl miraculously healthy despite all the violence that had brought her into the world, and Catalina stood by the nursery window looking at that tiny life when the noise in the hallway made her turn around. Preston was at the reception desk demanding to be let into Nadine's room, his face red with alcohol and rage, and between him and the desk, Tristan stood blocking the way, not raising his voice, not making a scene, only stepping close enough to Preston to say one sentence that only the two of them could hear. Catalina didn't know what Tristan said, but she saw the blood drain from Preston's face, as if someone had opened a valve, and he took 2 steps back, turned, and walked straight out the door without looking back. When Tristan returned to the hallway, Catalina asked him what he had said to Preston, and Tristan replied, "The truth. Sometimes the truth is more frightening than any threat." The next morning, Catalina offered Nadine and the baby a place in the carriage house behind the mansion. Separate, private, safe. Nadine looked at her with red, swollen eyes and asked, "Why are you helping me? I took your place. I believed everything he said about you." Catalina answered, "Because no one deserves what he does. Because helping you has nothing to do with him, and everything to do with us. With women who refuse to let men like him win, and because my mother taught me that surviving isn't enough. You have to help other people survive too, or what is the point of living at all?" Hollis Whitmore came to the mansion on a rainy evening without an appointment, and Edmund led him into the sitting room with a face full of suspicion, because the Whitmore name in this house was worse than a curse. And when Catalina stepped out and saw Preston's younger brother standing in the middle of her mother's sitting room with a file case clutched to his chest like a child holding a teddy bear, she almost told Edmund to throw him out. Hollis didn't resemble Preston in any way, 35 years old but looking younger, narrow-shouldered, eyes that kept darting away, his whole body radiating the unease of a man who had never fit inside his own family. And when he spoke his first sentence, his voice shook. "I know you don't have a single reason to trust me. I'm a Whitmore. That name is poison now, and it should have been poison a long time ago. Tristan was sitting in the chair by the fireplace, and he had already been there when Hollis arrived, as if he had known in advance. And perhaps he truly had, because Catalina had stopped being surprised by the things Tristan somehow knew before anyone said them. He looked at Hollis with that icy gaze that seemed to assess everything from his shoes to the way he held the file case. Then said, "You know what you're doing will make your family treat you like a dead man." Hollis nodded. "I know." Tristan tilted his head. "Brave, stupid, but I'll make sure no one touches you." Hollis set the file case on the table and opened it, and inside was something Catalina hadn't expected on this scale. Financial records showing that Garrett Whitmore, while he was still a federal judge, had accepted bribes from real estate developers whose cases he ruled on, money flowing through shell companies in Delaware into family accounts, verdicts always falling in favor of whoever paid. Evidence that Preston had systematically sabotaged small businesses around Greenwich Village, threatening residents into selling their homes cheap by sending people to harass them at night, damaging property, creating such fear and instability that they finally agreed to sell, bribing officials in the New York City Planning Department to speed project approvals. Every page was evidence of a family that treated the law as a tool for greed. Catalina asked, "Why now? Why not years ago when it could have saved my mother or kept Nadine from being pushed down the stairs?" Hollis looked down at his own hands. "Because I was a coward. Because I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. Because I benefited from their corruption while pretending my hands were clean. But I watched your show. I saw what you created from the ashes of what my family tried to destroy. And I realized that if I don't act now, then I'm not just a coward anymore. I'm an accomplice to whatever happens next." Tristan took the file, read every page with the concentration Catalina had grown used to, then said, "Evidence of corruption by a federal judge is heavy enough that the FBI can't ignore it. This isn't a civil case anymore. This is a federal criminal matter." He looked at Hollis. "You understand what this means for you personally?" Hollis nodded. "Losing the inheritance, being abandoned by my family, maybe having my life threatened. I understand all of it." Catalina offered Hollis a place to stay in the carriage house, on the same grounds as Nadine and the baby, a small community of people the Whitmore family had destroyed, now sheltering beneath Margaret Ashford's roof, and the irony of it wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The news spread quickly after that. The FBI confirmed it had opened an investigation into Garrett Whitmore based on new evidence. Vivica Whitmore, Preston's mother, reacted with the survival instinct of a woman who had lived in the world of power long enough to know when the ship was sinking, and through her lawyer she released a public statement. "After careful consideration, and in light of deeply troubling revelations regarding my son's conduct, I can no longer continue financial or public support for his legal efforts. A mother's love doesn't require enabling harm to others. It was pure damage control, a clean attempt to separate herself from her son in order to protect the family name, but it also cut off the money funding Preston's legal war." Blair Whitmore, Preston's sister, went further. On the evening news program she anchored, Blair looked straight into the camera and said, "The recent allegations concerning my brother reflect patterns of behavior that I can no longer ignore or excuse, and while I love my family deeply, I can't remain silent when women are being harmed. I believe them, and I'm sorry I didn't protect them sooner." It was social suicide where her father and brother were concerned, but it saved her television career because the public respected that she chose truth over family loyalty. Preston was isolated now, cut off financially by his mother, publicly betrayed by his sister, handed over by his brother, and exactly as Tristan had predicted, when the beast was cornered, it became most dangerous. Catalina's phone rang close to midnight. Preston's voice-over speaker was shaking with alcohol and rage. "You think you've won. You turned my family against me. You stole my brother's loyalty. You built your little empire on lies. But I want you to understand something clearly. I don't care about the money anymore. I don't care about the property. I care about making sure you understand what it means to stand against me. You'll regret every decision you've made since your mother died." Catalina looked at Tristan sitting across from her. He had heard every word on speaker, and she saw something shift inside him, not an explosion of anger, but something colder and far more frightening, a decision made somewhere behind those black eyes. He stood up slowly, put on his coat, and walked toward the door. Catalina knew where he was going. She knew Tristan Valenti wasn't a lawyer or a police officer. He solved problems in ways the law never got to see, and if he walked out that door tonight, something would happen to Preston that no one could undo. She stood and caught his arm. It was the first time she had touched him, not by accident, not in passing, but deliberately, her fingers tightening around his forearm through the fabric of his shirt, and she could feel the muscle beneath, hard as stone. "Don't," she said. "Don't do something you can't come back from." Tristan looked down at her hand on his arm. He stood still for a very long time. Long enough that Catalina heard the clock on the fireplace ticking through 30 seconds, then a minute, then longer, and she saw the war behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to walk out that door and the part of him that was looking at her hand. And in the end, he sat back down. He didn't say a word. She didn't let go. And in that moment, Catalina realized something it would take her a very long time to fully understand. She had power over this man. Not the power of manipulation like Preston had used on her. Not the power of money or threats, but the power of trust, the only kind of power a mafia boss can't buy, can't steal, and can't resist. The hearing chamber of the NYC Landmarks Preservation Commission was so crowded that they had to open an overflow room with a live broadcast for those who couldn't find seats, and Greenwich Village residents had been lining up since early morning around the block, people whose families had lived in the neighborhood for 3 or 4 generations, sitting beside people who had only moved there a few years ago, but all of them carrying the same fear that the place they called home was about to be flattened to make room for glass towers that none of them could ever afford to rent an apartment in. Catalina sat in the front row with Philippa Crane and Henderson Wolfe, the 70-year-old man still as intimidating as the day she first met him, and across the aisle Preston Whitmore sat with Aldrich Voss and a small group of paid consultants, but no family beside him, no mother, no sister, no brother. Only an isolated man with red eyes from lack of sleep, and a wrinkled suit for the first time since Catalina had known him. Chairwoman Elena Pritchard called the hearing to order and invited the developers to present first. Voss rose with polished, professional ease, presenting project graphics, projected tax revenue, job numbers, and visions of modernization, and every figure shimmered on the screen like a promise of pure gold. When Voss sat down, Henderson Wolfe rose, and every brick in the castle Voss had just built began to fall. The independent analysts in this report were paid 3 times the market rate, with bonus compensation tied to favorable outcomes for the project, he said, placing each document before the commission like loading bullets into a chamber. In addition, the studies claim the buildings have structural problems, but independent engineers confirmed they are entirely sound. The reports were deliberately falsified. Wolfe went on presenting evidence of bribery involving planning department officials, documents showing money flowing from Whitmore Development into the personal accounts of 2 members of the approval board, internal emails discussing pressure tactics aimed at residents to force them to sell their homes cheaply by creating disorder in the neighborhood. The members of the commission leaned forward, their expressions shifting from neutral to concerned. Then Catalina stood up, and the chamber fell completely silent. She held no papers, looked at no notes. She looked straight at the commission and said, "I'm standing here not as an heir or a designer, but as the daughter of a woman who spent the final years of her life fighting to protect this neighborhood while she was dying. My mother raised me here. She taught me my first sketch on the steps of a house 2 blocks from here. She knew the name of every bakery owner, every old man reading the newspaper in the park, every child riding a bicycle down the sidewalk. This isn't real estate. This is a community, and destroying it isn't development, it's erasure." The residents in the chamber burst into applause, and Chairwoman Pritchard had to strike the gavel 3 times before order returned. Next, Beckett Shaw stood, and the air in the room thickened, because everyone knew he had once been Preston's lawyer. "I'm here today as Mr. Whitmore's former attorney and as a witness to criminal conduct," he said in an even voice, but every word was clear. "During the course of representing Mr. Whitmore, I gained access to documents showing that he knew perfectly well the structural reports were false, that the payments to city officials were bribes and not consulting fees as recorded, and that the campaign to intimidate residents was coordinated directly from his office." Preston shot to his feet, his face turning purple with rage. Voss tried to pull him back down into his chair, but he slapped his lawyer's hand away as if brushing off a fly. "You betrayed me," he shouted at Beckett. "You were my lawyer and you betrayed me. All of you betrayed me." Chairwoman Pritchard warned him, "Mr. Whitmore, sit down and control yourself or you will be removed." But Preston had already passed the point of control, and the pressure of 11 months finally exploded in front of 300 people and a forest of cameras. "You want the truth, then here it is. He turned and looked straight at Catalina with wild eyes. "I sabotaged your mother's company. I bribed suppliers. I forced clients to break their contracts. I made sure you had nothing left to go back to because you were mine. I built you. I owned you. And if I couldn't have you, then nobody else would get to have anything you touched." The chamber went dead still. 300 people stopped breathing at once. Then the whispering broke loose like a dam giving way, and security moved in to remove Preston, while he kept shouting, kept pointing at Catalina, his eyes carrying the look of a man who had lost everything, and knew it, but still couldn't stop destroying himself. Voss sat alone at the defense table, his face drained white, because no lawyer in the world could save a client who confessed in the middle of a public hearing. The commission went into closed deliberation for less than 20 minutes, then returned. Chairwoman Pritchard read the ruling. The development application was denied, and the commission ordered a full investigation into all permits and approvals connected to Whitmore development in the Greenwich Village area. The residents rose to their feet applauding, some crying, some embracing each other, and an elderly woman in the back row took Catalina's hand as she passed and said, "Your mother would be so proud." Outside the chamber, beneath the autumn afternoon sunlight of New York, Philippa received a phone call and then turned toward Catalina and Henderson Wolfe, with an expression Catalina had never seen on her usually composed face. "The FBI has just officially confirmed that it is opening a separate investigation into Garrett Whitmore, based on the evidence Hollis provided combined with Cordelia's and Beckett's documents. This isn't a civil case or a zoning hearing anymore. This is a federal criminal matter, and the entire Whitmore family is now under scrutiny." Catalina stood on the sidewalk, looking at the sunlight falling across the old rooftops of Greenwich Village, the neighborhood her mother had fought to protect until her final breath, and she thought, "We won, Mom. The neighborhood is safe now." But she knew that tonight Preston Whitmore was somewhere out there with a public confession hanging over his head, with his family turned against him, with the FBI knocking at his father's door, and a beast cornered against the wall is always most dangerous right before it dies. The night after the hearing, Catalina was sitting in the design room with Margot, discussing the flood of new orders, when everything went dark. Not a gradual dimming like when a breaker trips, but all at once. The lights, the computers, and the security monitors, everything in the brownstone that ran on primary power went black in the same fraction of a second. Though the independent, battery-operated cameras silently continued to roll in the darkness, the house felt as if someone had thrown a black cloth across the whole building. Margot grabbed Catalina's hand in the dark and whispered, "That isn't a normal power outage. The backup system didn't kick in. Someone cut both the main power and the generator." Then came the sound of breaking glass. Not one crash, but several at the same time from different directions. The ground floor in front, the back kitchen door, the living room windows, like a coordinated attack. And Catalina knew at once this wasn't burglary, because burglars don't smash multiple entry points at the same time. This was a planned intrusion. Catalina pulled Margot into the small, windowless bathroom at the end of the third-floor hall and locked the door. And in the darkness, she heard heavy footsteps downstairs, then impacts, things crashing over, and then other sounds. The sounds of men fighting, of bodies hitting walls, of furniture being overturned, but no gunshots. And Catalina understood that Tristan's men were here. They were always here, out in the darkness beyond the mansion where she never saw them, and now they were doing the job they were paid to do. The chaos lasted several minutes, then concentrated in the second-floor hallway directly beneath where Catalina and Margot were hiding, and she heard footsteps racing up the stairs. Heavy, hurried footsteps, then the voice of a man she recognized instantly, even though she had tried to forget it for 11 months. "Catalina." Preston's voice rang through the darkness of the third-floor hall, hoarse with alcohol and desperation. "I know you're here. I'm not leaving until we've finished talking." His footsteps came closer, closer, and Catalina held Margot tighter in the dark bathroom, her heart beating so hard she was afraid Preston would hear it through the door. Then his footsteps stopped abruptly. Another voice cut through the darkness, low, calm, cold enough that the air itself seemed to drop several degrees. "She isn't here for you." The collision happened so fast, Catalina only caught fragments of sound. A short grunt, a body slamming into the wall, a crack like a branch snapping, a fist striking flesh. Once, twice, then the heavy final sound of a body hitting the hardwood floor. Silence. Then Tristan's voice, unchanged in the slightest, not breathless, not shaking, flat as a frozen lake. "Catalina, it's safe now. You can come out." She opened the bathroom door with trembling hands and saw the hallway in the dim beam of the flashlight Nico was holding at the far end. Preston Whitmore lay on the floor face down, his broken nose making a small pool of blood on the oak. His right arm bent at an angle. An arm should never bend. And Tristan Valenti stood over him, black shirt still buttoned to the throat, hair not disheveled, not a drop of sweat on his forehead, only the skin on his right knuckles scraped a little, the only evidence that violence had just taken place in that hallway. He looked down at Preston with the same expression people use for trash on a sidewalk, then looked up at Catalina, and in that instant she saw something different in his eyes. Not the familiar coldness, but relief, the kind of relief that belongs to someone who arrived in time. NYPD came 15 minutes later. The 4 men Preston had hired had already been subdued by Tristan's people downstairs, their hands bound with plastic zip ties, sitting against the living room wall like an ugly row of fence posts. The police looked at the scene, looked at Tristan, looked at Preston lying on the 3rd floor, and asked what had happened. Tristan answered in a tone of perfect politeness, as though he were speaking at a cocktail party. This man unlawfully entered the house and attempted to reach Miss Ashford's bedroom. I used reasonable force to stop him, self-defense. I'm sure the internal battery-powered security cameras will confirm it once the system is restored. One officer looked at Preston with the broken nose and broken arm, then looked at Tristan without a mark on him, and the expression on the officer's face said he didn't entirely believe the self-defense story, but also didn't want to dig too deeply into a man named Valenti. Preston was lifted onto a stretcher and taken to the police car. He would have his injuries treated at the hospital and then be transferred directly to jail. When the police cars and the ambulance left, when the sirens faded into the New York night, Catalina stood in the 3rd floor hallway looking at the small bloodstain on the wooden floor where her ex-husband had just been lying, and she cried, not from fear, not from pain, but because through all 5 years of her marriage and 11 months on the street, every time danger came, the person creating the danger and the person standing closest to her had always been the same man, and tonight, for the first time in her life, someone had stood between her and danger, had placed his own body like a wall between her and the person who wanted to hurt her, and she didn't know what to do with that feeling, because she had never been protected this way before. Tristan stood several steps away. He didn't come closer, didn't hold her, didn't offer comfort. He simply stood there in the darkness of the hallway and waited until she was done crying, patient and silent, the way he always was. 2 days later, Preston Whitmore was released on bail. The Whitmore family lawyers persuaded Judge Richard Carey, Garrett Whitmore's old colleague from their years on the federal bench, to sign a bail order for $2 million, a large sum, but not large enough to keep a Whitmore behind bars. Preston was fitted with an electronic ankle monitor and ordered to stay at least 300 meters away from Catalina. When Philippa called with the news, Catalina listened and wasn't surprised because she had lived long enough in the world Preston and his family operated in to know that money buys freedom, the law has a price, and an ankle monitor only restrains the people who choose to be restrained. 4 days after Preston was released on bail, Philippa called at 6 o'clock in the morning, and her voice carried an urgency Catalina had never heard before. Preston cut off his ankle monitor at 3 o'clock this morning. The U.S. Marshals have issued a fugitive warrant, but he's vanished. He isn't at the penthouse. He isn't at his mother's house. He isn't at any address connected to him. He planned this. Catalina called Margot immediately, but no one answered. She called a second time, a third, a fourth, and each time it went to voicemail. She called Edmund, and he told her Margot had left the mansion early that morning for the Ashford Haute Couture office in the garment district to prepare the shipment going out today. Catalina called the office number. The phone rang 7 times before someone picked up, but it wasn't Margot. It was Preston's voice, calm in a way that made her blood run cold, calmer even than the night he broke into the mansion, calm in the way of a man who had gone past fear and come out the other side where nothing mattered anymore. Hello, Catalina. Your cousin is here with me. She's fine, for now. I have something I think you'll recognize as serious, and I want to talk. Catalina felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. But she didn't collapse because 11 months on the streets of Chicago had taught her that panic was a luxury people who wanted to survive couldn't afford. She looked at Tristan standing by the window. He had heard every word on speaker, and before she even said anything, he had already taken out his private phone and called Nico in rapid, sharp Italian, then placed 2 more calls to men Catalina didn't know. Within 10 minutes, before NYPD had even finished setting up a perimeter, Tristan's people had sealed off 3 blocks around the Ashford Haute Couture office building on West 37th Street. They appeared from somewhere inside the underground network the Valenti family operated throughout Manhattan. Men dressed like ordinary people, but moving with the coordination of a military unit, cutting off every exit Preston could use. Tristan said to Catalina, "My men are in position. SWAT is on the way. He can't get out. Now you need to keep him talking. Keep him calm. Every minute he's talking is a minute Margot stays safe." Catalina held the phone in trembling hands, but her voice didn't shake, and she began talking to the man who had destroyed her life. Preston rambled, disjointed, lurching from accusation to pleading to rage. He said she had destroyed him, turned his family against him, stolen everything he had built. He asked why she couldn't just leave him alone, why she had to fight instead of accepting that she belonged to him. Catalina listened and answered just enough to keep him on the line, agreeing with things she didn't agree with, speaking gently to the man she wanted to scream at, and the whole time Tristan stood right behind her, one hand resting lightly between her shoulder blades, warm and steady and unmoving. And every so often he bent down and whispered into her ear in a voice only she could hear, "You're doing very well. My men are in place. Keep talking. You're saving her." His hand on her back was the only thing keeping her upright, because every second that passed was another second. Margot was in a room with a man who had lost all reason and was holding a weapon. 47 minutes after the call began, SWAT, working in coordination with Tristan's men, entered the building through a third-floor window and the rear fire escape at the same time. Catalina heard shouting, things crashing over, then Margot crying, then an officer barking commands, and then silence. The phone was still connected, but Preston wasn't speaking anymore. Nico called Tristan 3 minutes later. "Margot is safe, though she has a broken nose and some bruising from the struggle. She's being brought out now." Preston Whitmore swallowed an entire bottle of sleeping pills he was carrying before SWAT got into the room. "The medics are working on him." Catalina let the phone fall, and Tristan's hand on her back shifted, not into an embrace, not pulling her closer, only supporting her, keeping her upright when her legs wanted to give way. "Margot," she said. "I need to get to Margot." Tristan nodded. "The car is waiting." At the scene, Margot was sitting behind an ambulance wrapped in a silver blanket, her eyes red but no longer shaking, and when she saw Catalina running toward her, she stood and held her cousin tightly for the first time since Catalina had come home. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Preston Whitmore was taken to Bellevue Hospital in critical condition. The doctors pumped his stomach and stabilized him after 6 hours of emergency treatment. He lived, and when he opened his eyes, U.S. Marshals were standing on either side of his bed with a federal arrest warrant. He would never be granted bail again. The list of charges Philippa read to Catalina that evening was so long she had to sit down. Armed kidnapping, armed assault, unlawful entry, violation of bail conditions, violation of a protective order, property destruction, bribery of officials, fraud, and those were only the state charges. The federal charges added obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. Catalina listened and felt empty. Not relieved, not victorious, but emptied out in the way a person feels after the storm has passed, and she is left standing in the wreckage, looking around and wondering what is still there. Tristan sat across from her in the sitting room of the mansion, a glass of water in front of him just like that first night she had seen him keeping watch in the darkness of the kitchen, and he said, "He'll never get near you again. This war is over." Catalina looked at him and wanted to believe it, but she knew the war with Preston might be over while the war inside her was not, and she wondered whether that war would ever truly end. The trial took place on a Monday morning in early November at the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, the same building on Pearl Street where everything had begun months earlier, but this time there was no media circus outside, only serious reporters and familiar faces who had stood beside Catalina through every battle. Nadine Turner was called first, and she stepped onto the witness stand while her baby daughter slept in Dottie's arms on the back row. She told the story of her relationship with Preston from beginning to end in the calm voice she had practiced for weeks, from the gala where he charmed her with absolute attention, to the gentle suggestions that her friends weren't good enough for her, to taking control of her bank accounts in order to protect her, to the night he pushed her down the stairs because she had dared to praise Catalina's fashion show. The pattern was identical, step by step, like a formula Preston had perfected across victim after victim. "I loved him," Nadine said, looking down at her hands. "I didn't realize I was choosing a prison until the door was already locked. When it was Catalina's turn, she stepped onto the stand and saw Preston for the first time since the night he had been arrested in the mansion. He sat there in an orange prison uniform, noticeably thinner, eyes sunken, and for one brief moment, she almost felt sorry for him before she remembered Margot's broken nose and the way she had held her cousin beside the ambulance, and the pity vanished without a trace. She spoke about the marriage, not with emotion but with facts. Each step of the isolation, each act of financial control, each night his criticism eroded her identity, until she no longer knew who she was, except Preston Whitmore's wife. She spoke about the 11 months of homelessness, briefly and precisely, because she had told this story enough times to know which details mattered and which did not. The court-appointed defense attorney tried to push back, suggesting that Catalina was exaggerating, that she had financial motives to smear Preston, that a woman truly abused would not have been capable of rebuilding a fashion empire in a matter of months. Catalina looked directly into the lawyer's eyes and said, "I lived under an overpass in a Chicago snowstorm when it was -20. I ate out of trash cans. I was beaten in a shelter, and robbed in the night, and arrested for vagrancy. Do you really think I'm afraid of your questions?" The lawyer didn't ask another one. Hollis Whitmore stepped onto the witness stand, and the courtroom held its breath because a brother testifying against his own brother was something no one in the world of New York power had ever seen. Hollis spoke about how his father, Judge Garrett Whitmore, had taught Preston that the law was a tool to serve the family, and not the other way around. How Preston learned that controlling other people was the right of the strong, how the entire family closed its eyes while Preston destroyed each life he touched. Dr. Geneva Locke took the stand and explained the pattern of coercive control in clinical language, every technical term another nail driven into the coffin of Preston's defense. Mr. Whitmore did not merely abuse Miss Ashford, he attempted to erase her as a human being. Then Preston himself was brought to the stand, and this was where he destroyed himself, one final time. His defense attorney tried to guide him through a story of remorse and repentance. But Preston couldn't keep the mask on for more than 3 minutes. When the prosecutor asked about his relationship with Catalina, he leaned forward and said in the voice she had heard 1,000 times behind closed doors, "She was mine. I took her when she was nothing, and I built her into who she is. Without me, she would have remained a shadow of her mother forever." Catalina hadn't planned to say anything, but she rose from her seat, and her voice cut through the courtroom before the judge could strike the gavel. "You didn't build me. You destroyed me. You took a woman who had a family, and a career, and a future, and you tore her into pieces until she was digging through trash to stay alive. My mother rebuilt me from her grave. My mother left behind a legacy and conditions and love that she held onto for 5 years, waiting for me to wake up. You didn't build anyone, Preston. You only know how to destroy." The judge struck the gavel, but she didn't reprimand Catalina, and Catalina sat down with her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The jury left the room to deliberate. They returned 4 hours later. The foreperson stood and read each count, and after each one came the same word: guilty. Armed kidnapping, guilty. Armed assault, guilty. Unlawful entry, guilty. Bail violation, guilty. Bribery, guilty. Fraud, guilty. Each word fell like a hammer, and Preston sat there receiving every blow with a face growing emptier and emptier, because he had truly believed he would escape, that his name and his money and his charm would save him the way they always had, and the truth that they didn't save him this time seemed to break something final inside him. The judge sentenced him to 32 years. Preston didn't react. He simply stood when told, allowed the court officers to place him in handcuffs, and walked away without looking back, each step smaller than the last as though he were shrinking. Nadine took Catalina's hand and said, "We did it. They believed us." Catalina nodded, but she didn't feel victory, only ending, the heavy kind of ending that comes when something terrible has finally stopped. Outside the courthouse, the November sunlight was cold and sharp on Pearl Street, and Catalina saw him immediately. Tristan Valenti stood leaning against the black car parked across the street, a black cashmere coat over his shoulders exactly like that first night in the Chicago alley, and he didn't ask for the outcome because he didn't need to ask. He looked at her face and he knew. He nodded once. "It's over." 2 words. Nothing more. And somehow those 2 words were enough, more than any victory speech anyone else could have given. In the months after the trial, life didn't move forward in glory, but in work. The quiet, exhausting kind of work no one photographs for the papers, though it is the kind that rebuilds everything. Catalina and Margot worked 16 hours a day in the design studio, and the new collection drew its inspiration not from pain anymore, but from rebirth. Soft fabrics with sharp cuts, warm colors with strong structure. And when the collection debuted at New York Fashion Week, Ashford Haute Couture didn't just return, it stood where Margaret had always believed it belonged, at the top. Orders from Bergdorf Goodman, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Neiman Marcus poured in faster than production could keep up with, and fashion magazines called Catalina the greatest comeback story of the decade, but she didn't read any of the articles, because she knew the real story wasn't on glossy covers. It was in the sewing room at 3 a.m, when she and Margot sat on the floor, among piles of fabric scraps, drinking cold coffee, and laughing over a crooked seam. The second condition was fulfilled on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, when the NYC Landmarks Preservation Commission officially announced that the Greenwich Village neighborhood, including the entire zone the Whitmore Project had targeted, had been placed on the historic preservation list. Not one building would be demolished, not one family would be forced out, and when the news spread, the residents poured into the streets embracing one another, and an elderly woman knocked on the Ashford mansion door carrying a tray of baked pastries and said she wanted to thank Margaret's daughter. The Margaret Ashford Center opened in early spring, on the very land Preston had once wanted to turn into a luxury glass tower, and inside were transitional apartments for abused women, vocational training rooms, legal aid offices, a daycare center, and a small garden where people could grow flowers and vegetables. And the sign at the entrance read, "The Margaret Ashford Center for New Beginnings. Strength is not never falling, but rising every time you do." Nadine was one of the first people to enroll at NYU in social work, and she told Catalina that she wanted to become the person she wished she had met when she needed help most, and her daughter was walking now, and Dottie watched the little girl whenever Nadine went to class. Hollis Whitmore left New York completely, moving to Portland, Oregon, where he opened a small bookstore and lived the kind of life the Whitmore family would have called a failure. But for Hollis, it was the first time he had ever been able to breathe. Margot was no longer the resentful cousin, but the official business partner of Ashford Haute Couture, and she and Catalina signed the papers in Margaret's study beneath her photograph. And Margot said, "Aunt Margaret always wanted this, the two of us together." Beckett Shaw opened a small law office in Brooklyn dedicated to representing victims of domestic abuse for free, and the last time he saw Catalina, he told her that every case he won was an apology sent to his mother, even though she could no longer hear it. On a late spring afternoon, Catalina went alone to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, where Margaret lay beneath a simple headstone engraved with the words, "Margaret Ashford, loving without fear, building without rest." She knelt and placed fresh flowers on the grave and said softly, "I did it, Mom. I completed all 3 conditions. I saved the company. I protected the neighborhood. I built the center in your name. I did all of it with my own hands without depending on anyone, exactly as you wanted." She paused and touched her mother's name on the cold stone. "But more than that, I found myself again. I know who I am now, Mom. Not someone's wife, not someone's victim, just your daughter, and I will live worthy of that every day for the rest of my life." The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of the flowers Catalina had laid there, and she sat beside her mother's grave for a very long time, not crying, only sitting inside a peace she had forgotten she was still capable of feeling. Tristan came to the mansion on a late spring afternoon, just as sunlight was pouring through the green canopy of trees along the Greenwich Village street, where Margaret Ashford had lived her entire life. He was wearing the same black 3-piece suit he had worn on that first night when he stepped out of the Rolls-Royce in the dark Chicago alley, the cashmere coat draped over his shoulders, and Catalina understood at once that he had chosen that suit on purpose, as the final period at the end of a circle that had begun on that winter night. Edmund showed him in, but Tristan didn't need showing, because he knew the way to Margaret's study. He had sat in that room many nights standing guard while Catalina didn't know, and when he paused in the doorway, Catalina was standing by her mother's desk, sketching the next collection. She looked up at him, and the difference between the woman standing in the late afternoon sunlight today and the skeleton kneeling beside a trash bin 14 months earlier was so vast it was almost impossible to believe they were the same person. Her eyes were bright, her skin had color, her hand held the pencil with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she had been born to do, and the scar on her forehead had faded into a fine line that was almost invisible. Tristan looked at her for a long time, then said, "My debt to your mother has been repaid. Preston Whitmore is behind bars, The neighborhood is safe. Your company is thriving. You don't need me to protect you anymore. I don't have a reason to stay here now." His voice was as flat as ever, but Catalina had known this man long enough to hear what was hidden beneath it. And what was there wasn't coldness but fear, the kind of fear that belongs to a man giving her the chance to tell him to go, and he would truly go, because he kept his word better than anyone she had ever known. Catalina set the pencil down on her mother's desk. "You're right," she said. "You don't have a reason anymore, but if you want a new one, I can think of a few." Tristan didn't speak. He waited, and she saw the muscle in his jaw tighten like a man bracing for a blow. "My mother wrote in her will that I had to find my worth again without depending on any man," Catalina said, stepping away from the desk and walking toward him, "and I did. I saved the company with my own hands. I protected the neighborhood with my own voice. I built the community center with my own will. I didn't borrow $1 from you. I didn't ask you to solve anything for me that I could solve myself. I proved to my mother and to myself that I could stand alone, and now I'm standing here not because I need you, but because I want you. And there is a very big difference between those two things." Tristan swallowed hard, and Catalina saw for the first time since she had known him that the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast didn't know what to say. He said quietly, "I'm dangerous. Catalina, my world isn't beautiful. The people close to me live in darkness, and not everyone can bear it." Catalina stopped right in front of him, close enough to see the old scrape on his knuckles from the night he took Preston down in the hallway of this mansion. "I lived under an overpass in a Chicago blizzard," she said, looking straight into his eyes. "I was beaten, robbed, starved. I stood on the Michigan Avenue Bridge at 3 a.m, looking down into black water, and decided not to jump. Do you think I'm afraid of darkness? Do you think I'm afraid of danger?" And then Tristan Valenti smiled. For the first time in the entire story. It wasn't a wide smile or a warm one, just one corner of his mouth lifting and his eyes becoming a little brighter, but on a face that had never cracked open for any expression except coldness. It was an entire revolution. "No," he said. "I think danger should be afraid of you." He lifted his hand, palm up, fingers open, an invitation that wasn't an order, wasn't a demand, only a question asked in flesh instead of words. Catalina placed her hand in his. No kiss, no embrace, just two hands taking hold of each other. The hand of a woman who had once dug through trash to stay alive, and the hand of a man who ruled the underworld, and somehow those two hands fit as if they had been made to find each other. "One day at a time," Catalina said. "One day at a time," Tristan answered. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the windows of Margaret Ashford's study and fell across two people standing in the middle of the legacy of a mother who had loved her daughter enough to watch her collapse without running to her, enough to wait until her final breath, enough to believe that her daughter would find her way home, and enough to place that final protection in the hands of a mafia boss with a heart that knew how to be grateful. Catalina Ashford's story is a story about losing everything and finding herself again, about a mother's love stronger than death, about courage, not meaning the absence of fear, but feeling fear and still moving forward, about how salvation sometimes comes from the darkest places and the most dangerous people, about how a woman's worth doesn't live in the man standing beside her, but in the way she rises when no one is standing beside her at all. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with someone you love. Subscribe to our channel to hear more moving stories every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel, what it reminded you of in your real life, whether there was a moment that made you cry or made you want to hold your loved ones a little tighter. Please share your feelings in the comments below because we read every line, and every story you share with us is deeply precious. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace in every day, and if you're going through a difficult season right now, remember that every snowstorm eventually melts, and every spring eventually comes. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.